Thank you. Thanks for having me. Right, so this is going to be a sort of a horse of different color, I think, but in some ways it follows up nicely on the last talk, I think. So I've titled the talk "Experts in Left Party Politics: The Problem of Representation." The talk is actually based on my book, which is called "Leftism: Reinventions, Western Parties from Socialism to Neoliberalism." Just to give a bit of context, I started working on this book a really long time ago, longer than I like to admit, and in grad school. And at the time, before the financial crisis, before the conceivability of a Trump presidency in the U.S., of Brexit, or the pending prime minister, Boris Johnson becoming the pending prime minister in the UK, or the Sweden Democrats in a governing coalition in Sweden. The main things I was worrying about at the time were things that grad students worry about, like finishing their dissertations and finding a job. And because, partly for really generational reasons, was grappling with what happened to politics in the 90s, and in particular in the Clinton-Blair third wave period. In the process of grappling with that, I came across this thing that a friend in political theory suggested to me was the thing that I was really concerned with, which was neoliberalism. And so those became my concerns, along with finishing my dissertation and getting a job. And all of this was sort of rooted in, at the time, a sort of ill-defined anxiety over the direction of Western democratic politics, which says something maybe about my tendencies toward pessimism, because in the early 2000s, everything was great, right? Or well, up until September 11th, right? Around the year 2000, everything was supposed to be great. Markets had won, growth and prosperity had come to the world, and all that was supposed to be fabulous, especially if you were in the US. But I had this anxiety about where things were going. And so I set about trying to understand this thing, neoliberalism, and whether you could say that it was really something that had become part of mainstream politics, not just a matter of policy, not just about liberalization and deregulation and privatization, all those things. And if so, if it really had become a mainstream form of politics, then how do you explain neoliberalism on the left, right? And the neoliberalism of Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, this is not incredibly surprising. But how do you explain someone like Tony Blair or Bill Clinton? So my first thing was to try and just persuade myself, really, that you could say this was a mainstream form of party politics, that something had shifted the sort of center of gravity in mainstream political language in Western countries that was more sort of market-centered, let's say. And so this was my sort of first effort at mapping that out. So this is based on a content analysis, a pretty well-used data set of the content of the programs of political parties. This is political parties in 22 OECD countries for over the course of the post-war period up until 2004. And I left out all the far left, far right parties and focused just on center left, center right. And I really wanted to isolate here socialist, social democratic, labor parties, and I did include the Democratic Party here, and I am going to talk about why that's reasonable to do. So what you see here is you see everything is centered on a zero line, and it's a pretty simple index that I constructed where I looked at the programmatic emphases of political parties over the post-war period. And I had a certain working definition of neoliberalism in my head, and the definition was a sort of pullback from the protective welfare institutions that are associated with the glorious years from 1945 to the 1970s, an emphasis on markets, freeing markets, deregulation, liberalization, and shifting welfare institutions toward opportunity away from traditional social safety nets. So when you map it out in that way, then what you find, so these are center-left parties, and I've used these regime types. So this is like Australia and the US and Canada, and conservative or sort of Christian democratic regime types in continental Europe, mostly the Nordic countries, and Italy, Greece, which you have to read with some caution because in the early period only this is all just Italy. You need democratic countries to analyze party programs. But what you should notice here, the thing that was striking to me, is that in a certain completely sort of ahistorical sense, because neoliberalism took on a specific meaning, right, in the 1980s and 1990s, but in a certain ahistorical sense, center-right parties were always neoliberal, comparatively speaking, right? So that's why you see all these bars above the zero line, and what you see for center-left parties is you see, especially in countries that are not, so this is not the US, right, not the UK, where you might expect the sort of most market-centric politics or emphases to be in evidence, but what you see is this shift positive over time across all of the regimes. So, so this was enough to persuade me that this was a thing. And I was surprised enough by this that it also was enough to persuade me that we needed to understand especially what was going on in Western European countries in particular that have strong socialist, social democratic parties, or have historically had strong socialist and social democratic parties, which of course the US has not. So that sort of sets the stage for what I wanted to understand. So in the book, I also get into the actual content of what parties say. This will be maybe familiar to many people in the room. There's variations, of course, in how parties talk in the late 90s or around the year 2000 about what left parties should do and what they stand for. But pretty much across the board, you get emphases on opportunity, you get emphases on globalization, which is a code for free markets, or free markets is a code for globalization. They often kind of come together as these forces out there that have to be adapted to, worked with, harnessed, right? And then reforming, doing other kinds of policies sort of in a way that conforms to what markets want. Right? So we'll equalize things after markets have done their thing, or we'll make welfare state institutions kind of fit with free markets, or we'll even make welfare institutions mimic markets. We'll make them more, we'll introduce competition into them. We'll introduce competitive incentives and price-like mechanisms, choice, right? Things like that. So the other emphases that you get in this period is a heavy emphasis on pragmatism. We're going to do what works, right? We're not about ideology anymore. Ideology is over. We're not about dogma. We're going to try things, and we're going to see what works in the world that we're in. This isn't so much in the text that I have up here, but there was often also a theme, especially in the American context, of we know we're on the right track because we're winning, right? Because we're winning elections, and so we know that this is a set of positions that is winning with the public. Right, so in the book, I summarize that as sort of three emphases that are the hallmark, the sort of trademark talking points of third way politics, and that is the market, what works, and what wins. There's still at this time a very strong claim to, but we are still social democrats, or we're still left. Right, so we still believe in social justice. We still believe in being worried about inequality and the distribution of wealth and things like that. And so we're going to do stuff in a way that corrects for the market's downsides. Right, and this is again this theme of we're going to let markets do their thing, and then we'll kind of work around the edges. So for purposes of this talk, what I want to emphasize is the particular problem, the representation problem that you get, I think, when you're dealing with left politics or left parties. And this is a set of concerns that became especially clear to me from reading Pierre Bourdieu. One of the things that Bourdieu talks about is that the particular sort of dilemma, and this is a dilemma that lots of people, going back to Gramsci at least, have worried about, is a particular dilemma on the left is that you're trying to speak for people who are disempowered for a variety of reasons in political life, who have difficulty fully accessing, fully using their own voice. Right, they're resource deprived, they're marginalized from politics, they don't speak the right language, they don't have any time, they don't have any money. Right, and so what you get is this dilemma that is at work inside in left politics and left parties, which is these institutions that are meant to speak for the most disempowered people have a great deal of autonomy to speak for them, right? And so it's easy in that case for left parties to be representing people in a way that doesn't meaningfully represent them, right? That's not in dialogue, or that doesn't really meaningfully express their interests. And so that's why, for a long time, sort of Gramscian or Marxian problematic was about how you keep parties grounded, right? How you keep them linked to people's real concerns, where trade unions were an important mechanism. So this is what I think of as left party special representation problem. And the way I think about it is as a historical concern, that it's not so much about left parties per se, as it is the future of Western democracy writ large. The term left means a lot of things in Western contexts, but all those meanings have a shared origin, claims to equality, including the equal representation of disempowered groups. And for that reason, left parties have a unique historical responsibility to speak for the poor, the disadvantaged, the disenfranchised. And in that role, they are, by extension, barriers to the descent of democracy into plutocracy. So this is the sort of historical reason that I'm particularly interested in left parties. And I think this representation problem, and I'll talk about this more, becomes really obvious in the third way period, right? Because what you get is what I describe here as an elite celebrity politics that casts free markets as a means to equality, which plainly they were not. And I think that in many ways, we are living with the consequences of that right now. So this is something that I've said has my interest in this have to do partly with sort of my own biographical trajectory, and as a good sociologist, what I wanted to do was try and back off of this particular period and try and get some historical perspective and try and formulate a good analytical questions that kind of don't have a politics of blame built into the questions that I ask. So a lot of the analyses or discussions in the academic literature that I've read of the third way years is really about the question of blame. Have they abandoned social democracy? Have they failed in some fundamental way? And those questions are important, but I wanted to understand analytically how you get left politics that looks like this. Right? I wanted to explain it and make it into an analytical question, which is why I backed off from just this particular form of left politics and tried to get more historical perspective. So this is, we switched here to the rhetoric of the German SPD in 1998. Another instance of neoliberalized leftism, right? The market and competition, politics centered on the market and dependent on competition, and a certain understanding of the market as this thing out there that kind of manages itself, but we're going to still worry about these other things around the edges. So this is a pretty standard kind of markets, what wins and what works kind of trilogy. But there is what came before it, which is what I started calling, at first I was calling it Keynesian leftism, but that's not quite right. So I started calling it instead economistic leftism, this very technical kind of language that was more or less as if parties were speaking through the mouths of economists in the mid-1960s, right? A language of the technical management of economies that governments have the power and should also have the obligation to grow the economy, right? So that in a way that everyone can share in the national product. And this very technical language, full employment while maintaining a stable currency, increase productivity, and raise general prosperity, right? And especially through the management of the budget, right? So this very kind of technocratic language, which at the time is understood as the end of ideology, but there were people even in that moment who were saying this is very ideological indeed. And there was something that comes before this. If you stay in Europe, and we're not worried about the Democrats yet, and you go back to the beginnings of these same parties, then you find them speaking in terms of the language of the means of production. Right? So instead of speaking through the mouths of economists, they're speaking through the mouths of Marx and Marxian thinkers, right? Their way of dividing up the world and understanding economic questions and what to be done about it is completely textbook Marxian language, right? And this is true for parties that are supposed to be more revisionist, right? For the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, it's a very similar kind of language and understanding of history in terms of class struggle, and the main sort of problematic being about control of the means of production. And the problem of class inequality and class oppression. It's true for the Labour Party. It's not true for the Democrats, of course. So what I decided was that the question that I should ask shouldn't be focused just on how we get here, but how we get these two reinventions, right? Can we construct a broad explanatory analysis of how you get from in the same parties over time in these different time periods around the 1920s, around 1960 or 1965, and around the end of the 20th century, how you get these two transitions, right, where parties start speaking these very different languages. And the result was this book, now available from Harvard University Press and at fine bookstores near you. And I focused in on, for reasons I'm happy to talk about, on these four political parties: the Democrats, the German SPD, the Swedish Social Democrats, and the British Labour Party. So that is a long introduction really to the motive for the book. So here's what I'll do in the rest of the talk. I can talk a lot about existing accounts. I'm not going to talk as much about existing accounts as I sometimes do in other places, because I want to spend plenty of time on this part, analysis and main arguments. So there are existing accounts, and some of these are more accounts that apply especially to the third way transition. So I'm especially emphasizing those here. One of the common explanations was it's what the voters wanted, right? It's what the third way politicians themselves said. Well, we're winning. It's what the voters wanted, right? So that, I think, is an especially important set of explanations to engage with, so I'll engage with that as well. There's also the argument that this is what markets require. This is what the economic moment requires. We have no choice. And then, especially in Western Europe, there is the argument that this all has to do with the weakening of trade unions. So my concern with these accounts is not so much that they're wrong. That's what I put up here, because I'm sometimes it's easy to misinterpret my argument here. It's not so much that they're wrong, but it's that they don't really they conceive of parties in the wrong way, of how they work and how causality works through party organizations. And so what I suggest is a different way of thinking about parties, where my catchphrase is that parties are prisms and not pinballs. And I have this causal metaphor of refraction for how things work, if indeed parties can be thought of usefully as prisms. And then I focus, and this goes back to that question of representation, left party representation, I focus especially on figures I call party experts. So I'll talk about what I mean by that term. And then I have particular arguments about how to characterize each of these reinventions in terms of the typical kinds of experts that spoke for parties in these different time periods. So I try to sort of typify, right, what are the hallmark characteristics, what kind of training, what kind of credentials, what kind of biographical trajectory do you find in these different time periods, such that it becomes possible for parties to be sort of speaking in these different voices, these different theoretical voices. So in the first reinvention from socialist to economistic leftism, I sort of typify the kinds of experts you get in these two periods, and then the question, of course, is how you move from one to the other. And so I'll dwell on that part especially. So let me say a little bit more about this voters made them do it account, which I have a particular complaint about. And I'm happy to come back to these other B and C kinds of arguments as well, but in the interest of time, I will focus just on the first one. So the voter demand thesis. So taking the example of the US here, what you see here is the share of the vote going to different presidential candidates, where the light shaded part in the bottom is Democrats, the darker gray on the top is Republicans, and then the black bits at the top are third party independent candidates. So I put in here the sort of third way period. It's relatively common, and the line, what you see here is voter turnout. Right? So there's a long period here of voter turnout, there's a little blip here in 1992. This is the year Clinton is elected. You might notice also the giant black bar at the top, because this is also the year when Ross Perot polls polls 19%, unprecedented in, except in 1968, right? So a third-party candidate or an independent candidate polls 19% of the presidential vote. And it's only in that year that voter turnout ticks up, right? And then it stays, it continues on its downward trend, right, into the second Clinton election, right, which they won by a landslide, right, with less and less people voting. But they didn't actually, because he actually never got the majority of the vote. So hopefully you can see right away why I have a bit of a complaint with it's what the voters wanted argument, right? That you could make an argument that what's actually happening here is demobilization, fewer and fewer voters actually turning out to vote, that changing only when there's a real alternative in the form of Ross Perot, who you might remember was his main campaign point was anti-NAFTA, right? And then continuing decline, and then as things become more contentious after 9/11 with the financial crisis, then things start to look different. So you could also look at this in a congressional level. So this period, what you have here, this jagged line, is Democratic dominance in Congress for the period from 1960 forward. That collapses in the 1990s and is never to return. The Republicans gain, but really a lot of what's happening here, and I've cheated and put this on two axes, because third-party independent voting has always been relatively small, right? These are small percentages, but I want to give you a sense of what's happening with these patterns and what's happening with that pattern, right? So the same kind of thing where you have a sort of decline, apparent decline, especially of what had been the dominant party in congressional politics on the national level in the United States for many decades. And you have the rise of third-party independent voting. In other words, voters are not going to Republican candidates. And you can show this in other ways, too. So you get similar patterns in West Germany, Sweden, and the UK. There are important differences, different party systems, right? Different dynamics, different institutions. So it's not precisely the same. But a similar kind of decline in the third wave years, especially of voting, right? And a similar kind of, it starts coming back when the black bars at the top start appearing, a similar kind of uptick in most cases when there are new options, especially in this case on the far right. This is UKIP up here, I believe. And so this pattern holds more or less with some important variations. One of the things that's important about the UK is you get this new kind of center party, a break off from Labour in the form of the Social Democratic Party. That's what that middle bar shows. So the sort of fracturing process looks a little different, but there's the same kind of pattern of declining voter turnout in the third wave years, a general sort of squeezing of the margins for mainstream center parties, the arrival and increasing popularity of center-right parties that we're concerned about now. And that pattern more or less holds across all the countries that I deal with. What you can argue, right, is that the general pattern here is one of political fracturing, declining turnout. There's also other ways you can map it in terms of party membership, identification with political parties, things like that. All of that is declining with mainstream parties during this time. Right? So again, hopefully you can see why I have some complaints about the argument this is what the voters wanted. You could as easily argue that this was a period of demobilization and alienation from mainstream parties, especially on the left. So how do you then approach this question, right? So what I tried to do is get away from there's often a way of thinking about parties, which is kind of, there's this, I call it the party society problematic. Parties do things because voters want, or parties lead the voters. But either way, what's happening has to do with only one of these two kinds of dominant forces, right? So what that doesn't leave you any room for is any way of understanding political parties as organizations, as networks, as social relations, where there are actual people doing things on a daily basis. So this refraction approach was meant to not, on the one hand, deny that things like changes in the economic world are important, or the decline of trade unions is important, or what voters want or how they vote isn't important. All those things are important, but it's not then determinant necessarily of what parties do, because there is this process inside political parties of interpreting the world out there, deciding what it means if they lose an election or win an election, for instance, or deciding what it means if they're in a new economic world where it doesn't seem they can govern in the same way they once could. And then they decide on the basis of what they think that means, what's to be done about it, right? So it's that process that I'm interested in, right? That sort of process of refraction. And so that's why I have this way of thinking about parties as prisms and not pinballs, right? They're not things that get pushed around or that push other things necessarily. They're things that have these internal sort of interpretive dynamics. So this is not rocket science. I don't mean it to be a radical claim. I think it's pretty much common sense, right? There's stuff out there that happens in the world. There are people in party networks who decide what it means, what's important, what to do about it, right? And then there's what parties do. So that's a fairly simple way of thinking about parties, but I find that it's not the dominant way that parties are often analyzed in the social scientific literature. And then I had this particular concern, which is grounded in Antonio Gramsci's thinking. I don't think anyone has ever understood politics better than Antonio Gramsci, so I think it's a safe bet. And he has this whole discussion of the sort of component elements of a political party, right? That you have to have the leadership, you have to have the power or office seekers, right? In a political party, you have the mass element. And so that's what I'm characterizing here, is this element that's oriented toward representation or vote seeking, mobilizing the troops, right? He uses these military metaphors. And then you have this intermediate element that I'm calling here as truth claiming, an orientation toward truth claiming, right? So he says parties have this intermediate element that articulates leadership in represented groups, right? Maintaining contact between them morally and intellectually, right? They're kind of this connective, they serve this connective function, right? This communicative function between these two groups. Gramsci is, of course, particularly concerned with the Communist Party, right? And especially it's about how a Communist Party should work, right? So I shift this around a little bit and I say, well, I think you can say it's generally true that in any political party, they do have to deal with these competing demands, right? They need to seek votes, they need to be concerned about winning office, and they need to be concerned about generating a programmatic language, right? So instead of thinking of these as sort of elements in any essential sort of categorical way, I think of them as orientations, right? People inside parties are always juggling these competing priorities, right? And then you have people who are maybe more specialized or more recognized in party networks as experts, as people who are qualified to interpret the world. And so from that, I then focus in on these particular figures, these particular intermediary figures, and I built an analysis in the book that is centered biographically on party experts, essentially, where my goal was to, over time, to situate institutionally, biographically, historically, party experts, to trace their movement through time, to understand how they're positioned institutionally with respect to parties, with respect to social scientific professions, with respect to other institutions, whatever they may be, and to understand and to try and identify their sort of characteristic ways of seeing the world, right, what I call their ethics. And so I won't explain this. This is kind of grounded in a broader sort of field theoretic understanding of the world that will take too much time for me to explain. But the important thing that I want to emphasize here is this is not about a sort of intellectual claim about who is rightfully an expert or who isn't an expert. I don't mean to get into the politics of that. So that's why I have this emphasis on action orientations, that it's not really about somebody being essentially an expert or not. But the question is, what do they do? Right? What are they doing inside parties? What kinds of, it's kind of functional really, right? What function do they perform? On what basis are they recognized as authorities, right? Inside party networks. So this sort of radically opens up the question of what an expert is in a certain way, because I'm totally agnostic about whether a person needs to have any particular training or skills or expertise. They can be anyone, right? And so then the question is, well, where do they come from? How do they acquire this kind of authority such that they become party spokespersons? So conveniently, the labor and social democratic parties in Western Europe are all born around the same time for reasons that are not accidental. And so I start with the origin point, and I start especially with a particular office, a particular position inside political parties, which is the position of a Minister of Finance or a Minister of Finance to be. Right? So these parties are organized as the Western European parties are organized sort of in the image of states, right, such that they're ready to move into government should they be able to win. And so they know when they're not in office who is going to or who is likely to occupy the position of finance minister, right, based on that person's recognized expertise on economic questions. So I wanted to focus in especially on these people, right, kinds of what are their origins, where do they come from, are they similar in some ways, are they historically distinctive? And then through time, these figures, of course, do not act alone. They have networks of advisors, and they are, move in a world filled with other kinds of experts and assistants. So I also wanted to know who those people were, the people around them. I had to approach this a little bit different for all kinds of probably fairly obvious reasons. In the case of the American Democratic Party, which, as I've said, was never a socialist party, and is not an organization in the way that I've described. Right? It's not a government in waiting in the way that I've described. It has to do with the unique, or relatively unique, features of the Democratic and Republican parties, which are not really organizations, and certainly not in the bureaucratic sense of these other parties. So what I do then is I focus on economic experts, especially around presidential candidates. So the figures you see here are the first finance ministers in our respective parties. This is the Labour Party, the Swedish Social Democratic Party, the German Social Democratic Party, and then the one economist on the brain trust, on FDR's brain trust in 1932, this fellow, this institutional economist named Rexford Tugwell. So I focus on this particular location over time inside parties and party networks in an effort to kind of make it a more clear sort of comparative analysis where I know I'm not talking about people who occupy completely different directions or positions across time. So I use a whole variety of empirics, but really the core of it is memoirs, biographies, autobiographies, as I get into the more current period, online information, biographical, professional information, CVs, those kinds of things, and self-accounts, right? I'm especially interested in self-accounts where people were talking about what's their role, what's their job, right, in politics. And then the idea here, like I said before, is not to ignore things that are happening outside of parties. And one of the things that you can do when you start approaching things in this biographical way is you can see how a whole institutional world changes over time, right? Professions or institutions that did not exist in one time exist in another time. They make new kinds of people possible. So one of the assumptions I'm making here is that you have these sort of institutions out there that produce people who are different in kind, types of people who are different in kind, who are possible in one historical moment, not possible in another. So I'm interested in those conditions of possibility. And there's a sort of analytical argument here that I make, which is about the value of doing this kind of biographical analysis. And in my case, that you can historicize party experts. And one of the advantages of that is you can avoid that politics of blame I was talking about before, where Tony Blair gets up and says, but I'm not a neoliberal, right? And then an analyst or an academic doing an analysis of social democratic politics or third-way politics or labor politics in that case and saying, yeah, you are, right? So what I'm assuming here is that first-person accounts are sincere, right? That they say something about the perspective of the person in the time and place, so that when Tony Blair or a Swedish Social Democratic Prime Minister says, I'm not a neoliberal, but still embraces all kinds of market-centered, market-conforming policies, that they believe that to be true. And then you have to understand what it is about their world such that they can believe that to be sincere. So I'll get into the analysis. Right. Which is somewhere in here. So what I do then is I track these different kinds of experts over time, right? And the general argument here is that as you get in the world of party networks, these new kinds of experts, you get people who see things in new ways, they understand their role in politics and political life in new ways, and what you get then are qualitatively different kinds of worldviews and programmatic languages coming from left parties over time. So let's start with our first experts around 1920. And again, I'm leaving out the Democratic Party for this first part for obvious reasons. And so if we ask, in looking at the position of finance minister, who speaks for parties around 1920 on economic questions, then the type that I come up with is a particular figure that I call the party theoretician. I'll explain why I give the figure that title. So here we are. These figures, and see, crossed out, because not that. So when the German SPD, the Swedish Social Democratic Party, the British Labour Party first entered government in the early 20th century, they appointed a particular kind of person as Minister of Finance. This person was a man born between the mid-1860s and the mid-1870s. He'd come of age along with, in the midst of, the formation of socialist parties. He was more highly educated than the vast majority of people in his country, but he had no formal training in economics, which at that time was not, it was a discipline, but it wasn't fully autonomous from other disciplines like law and statistics. And of course, there were not very many economists or political economists at that time. None of them had any training whatsoever in anything that we could call economics or political economy in a formal setting, right? In no case were any of these people university-based academics. They established themselves as authorities on economic questions through socialist societies, clubs, associations, and especially in newspapers and journals. They were journalists, many of them. And that was linked to their efforts to build socialist parties and also to democratize, to expand political rights such that socialist parties could then be elected. And so they understood themselves as agitators, right? And so it was agitation, but it was through trying to persuade workers and people who otherwise might be more swayed by liberal politics, by liberal politicians and liberal parties, that they should see things in a socialist way, right? They should identify their aims with the aims of socialist and social democratic parties. So there are a few notable things here. One thing that I emphasize in the book is that none of these figures, not only were none of them academics or trained in any formal way in economics or political economy, but that they became, none of them became party experts because of their working class status precisely, or because they were deeply involved in organized labor. In some cases, especially in Snowden's case, there was a clear oppositional relationship with organized labor. The trade unions did not like him, especially, partly because he was not on board with the general strike. So what you see then, if you trace their biographies through time, is they move through very specific kinds of institutions. They work for they become editors for theoretical journals that are published by political parties themselves, or they become lecturers at party schools in the case of Hilferding, or they become recognized as kind of organizers and public lecturers who make contributions to, say, a liberal newspaper where they try to persuade the readership that socialism is really the better way to see things, which was the case Friedrich Thorsen. All of them become professionally, occupationally dependent on political parties for their livelihoods in order to be intellectuals at all, in order to spend their time, right, producing intellectual stuff. They're dependent on political parties, which is why I call them party theoreticians, right? In other words, they never would have become experts in public life had these institutions not existed and made it possible. So Hilferding is a great example. He was a doctor by training who was frustrated in his efforts to write Finance Capital, which I think you referenced earlier, because he couldn't dedicate his time full-time to intellectual production that was made possible by the German SPD. So there's a clear kind of institutional basis for this particular figure. They were, to sum up, party theoreticians who had this historically particular authority that had been incubated in and they were professionally dependent on the institutions of the new mass parties of the socialist left. Right, so this is just some biographical information, and here's where just for your information, the kinds of publications that they were associated with. So if you're going to characterize their ethic, then I would characterize their sort of ethics as agitation, right? Their job is to make working classes see things in a socialist frame of reference. right? They are agitating for socialism. So this entailed a certain sort of perspective on the economic world, as we've seen, a Marxian perspective, right, on the economic world in terms of classes and class interests and class antagonisms, right? This was their understanding of what was some of the most important things to understand in questions like the ownership of the means of production. So around the same time that these become powerful figures in center-left parties and in governments, insofar as center-left parties are successful in obtaining office, there is a different way of seeing the economic world, which around 1920s, 1930, and I'm putting Keynesian in quotes here because one of the people I have here is, for instance, Irving Fisher, who's not a Keynesian, still recognized for his contributions to econometrics. And then there is Mr. Keynes down here. But what I'm trying to give you a sense of is how they saw the economic world, how they thought about it. What was it, right? When you talk about this thing called the economy, what was it, right? And it was, for Fisher, literally a physical model that he made in which you could operate the levers and the pulleys and you could imitate the dynamics of a price system, which he used for teaching purposes, for lecturing purposes. Or in the case of Keynes, right, boiling things down to supply and demand curves. Right? So this sort of mechanical conception of economy is as this manipulable thing. Right? And you might note here also that these figures, or kind of in the 1920s, 1930s, have no relationship whatsoever with socialist or social democratic parties. If anything, they are opposed to them. Keynes was a staunch liberal who explicitly understood the Labour Party as a party that he could not be a part of because it didn't represent his class. It didn't mesh with his class position. In the United States, figure like Irving Fisher, he was a public figure. He had a lot of he had a public presence, but he was a sort of apolitical, nonpartisan, progressive reformer, right? And this was characteristic of economists, of trained economists, right, credentialed economists. At this time, they were public figures. They thought of the economy in this sort of manipulable way, but they were nonpartisan, and they certainly were not socialist or social democratic or partisan, explicitly partisan in those cases. So they had this way of thinking about the economy. The economy is this manipulable entity that doesn't necessarily function well on its own, right? It's not about class and class opposition and the means of production, right? It's this sort of set of technical questions. And so what that means is that policymakers can and should use taxation, right? Famously for Keynes, fiscal policy to soften recessions and support full employment, right? So I'm characterizing this as a Keynesian worldview just as a sort of way of characterizing the way economists thought at a certain time and place, whether or not they were actually in any way, whether they were Keynes or used Keynes is not, to my mind, the most important thing here. It's about how they kind of saw the world. So then what you see in this first reinvention, when I try to map out in the book, is how you get from these party theoreticians who are grounded in left parties to a world in which these very similar figures in the 1960s who see things in a very similar way, in all of these parties become finance ministers or become the sort of primary economic experts on matters of economic policy within their respective parties. So they're sort of generationally similar. They're similar in their outlook and perspective. They're similar in their training. They have formal credentials in economics and in statistics and statistical analysis. And they all occupy in their respective parties, in their respective countries, they tend to come to occupy the very positions that these figures once held. Right? So how do you explain that? So I point to a few things, a few dynamics. And I call it, I call this moment, it all emerges like everything, right, out of the 1930s and the disruptions in the 1930s. And I refer to as this Polanyian moment, a moment in which there's, as arguably now, there's a recognition that what is good for publics and democratic institutions is not necessarily good for the markets and vice versa, where you have this kind of recognition that there's a disjuncture going on. And what that does is it pushes academics, especially younger generation academics and economists and training, into more political questions, into a more political stance, where they become involved with, for instance, Labour Party networks in the university level, and especially in the Oxbridge institutions in the case of the UK. And because the problem of of mass unemployment was the primary concern of the day, it also pushes parties, left parties, social democratic parties, to seek out people who are capable of tracking economic questions, accurately measuring the scale of unemployment, for instance, and diagnosing the problem. So in this moment in the 1930s, and there are other important things, like in the British case, the wartime planning and economic management is obviously incredibly important. There's variations across cases. But the story that I trace for both, there's also important differences for the German case. But the general story that I trace is this story of a kind of coming together, a merging of professional economics professions as the economics professions are becoming Keynesian, as in younger generation economists who see things in a Keynesian way become dominant, and they're coming together at the same time and becoming more interdependent institutionally and in terms of sort of networks of exchange with left party organizations. So what you get are these economists who are more or less explicitly partisan actors, right? They are economists and they are social democrats or labor rights or what have you, right? And they see things, so they, on the one hand, they move between these two worlds, right? Their whole professional life is about sort of moving in between the economics profession and left parties. So this refers to, this is Paul Samoson's description of Seymour Harris in an obituary where he describes the Democratic Party and JFK and his academic world as his home, right? And the argument that I make in the book is that this position has a relationship to how they see the world and their role in politics. And I characterize this as a Keynesian ethic. So this is Walter Heller's discussion of what the economist is meant to do and what the management of the economy is meant to accomplish, right? Economists in his time, they're more responsible, they're more exposed, right? They have to navigate the opposing necessities of being a scientist, right? Being committed to truth versus being partisan and moving in partisan and political circles, which are not totally reconcilable things. And they navigate that, and they can do that largely because of the growing professional, parentheses, Keynesian consensus, right? So you have the backing of your profession, and so you're not sort of tainted by politics and partisanship. You're insulated from it. And what that means for Heller is that you can't be a sort of detached Olympian, right? This is the truth of the world and politics has to conform to it kind of thinker. You can't see things in that way and perform your public role as an economist. So I characterize this as a Keynesian ethic. Economists help governments manage economies and markets in scientifically grounded and strategically practical ways. Now we might contrast this with what I call in the book neoliberal ethics. So Heller's contemporary, one of his contemporaries, who is becoming very influential and important public figure in the mid-1960s, mid to late 1960s, especially through his involvement in the Goldwater campaign, is Milton Friedman. Right? Milton Friedman and Heller are in public, they are engaged in public debates. So we could contrast how Heller sees things with how Friedman describes the world, right? And this is his conception of the market. It's this thing out there. It's like gravity or the sun. It's a set of forces out there in the world. It cannot be controlled. It cannot be manipulated. We don't tell them what to do. We do what it wants, right? And this has consequences for the role of the economist in public life, right? So we should, things should operate according to rules rather than discretion, right? So the way I characterize the neoliberal ethic, of which I think Milton Friedman is a great articulator, is that the role of economists in public life is to limit politics in order to set markets free. Right? Their job is to guard the freedom of markets. So what you might be thinking is, yeah, but Milton Friedman was allied with Republicans, so why should this matter for left politics? And it's a good question. So what I looked into then were the ways in which, in what direct or indirect ways, could the thinking of an economist like Milton Friedman become consequential for political actors on the left. So I traced the development of neoliberal intellectual centers, professional economics, law, especially University of Chicago. I traced the development of free market think tanks, and the process by which neoliberal economists become especially influential, right, in national party politics. And if you overlay this with what's happening in economics as a profession at this time, right, by the 1960s, Keynesian economics has made Keynesianism the sort of dominant public language, right, to talk about and to talk about economic questions, and by extension, the economist has become a very influential public figure, right? During this time also, so this maps the growth of the American Economic Association. So the neoliberal and the first sort of institutions, the Mont Pelerin Society, Hayek's Road to Serfdom, these sort of events, early events in the formation of neoliberal intellectual networks. At that time, economics is a relatively small profession. In the US case, this is true in other cases as well. By the time Hayek gets the Nobel Prize in 1974, economics as a profession has grown incredibly, and part of that is because it's so central to government and politics, right? There's a lot of demand, right? Part of it also is just the general growth of the social sciences in this time. And so what I emphasize is that the position of or the role of sort of neoliberals in this world is the politicization of economics, which starts well before inflationary crises of the 1970s, right, where they start to define an alternative position, a different way of thinking about the world. And so in that sense, they play a role in the breakdown of that scientific consensus that Heller identifies as so important for an economist to play a role in public life. That's what this tracks, the politicization of economics in the US, the process at the end in the 1960s, 1970s, when people don't start talking about economists in the media, they start talking about Republican or Democratic economists. Or conservative or liberal economists. I trace also the process of the formation of new progressive think tanks, which maps directly along with the formation of free market think tanks, and characterize that as sort of competitive response to the influence, perceived influence of free market think tanks. And then this thing that's really a sort of professional dynamic that's going on inside economics, where with the rise of not necessarily Milton Friedman, but people who work with Friedman to develop things like rational expectations theory, is this argument that you cannot be a Keynesian economist and really be a scientific economist anymore. We live in a world in which that is impossible, right? Walter Heller is not an economist anymore, right? In a scientific sense, in the definition here of Lucas and Sargent, where they're saying the central fact is that Keynesian policy recommendations have no sounder basis in a scientific sense than recommendations of non-Keynesian economists, or for that matter, non-economists, right? The sort of scientific delegitimation of figures like Walter Heller. So this, of course, is a long story. It intersects with all kinds of geopolitical trouble, oil shocks, inflation, right, all kinds of things. I trace the sort of development of the stagflation diagnosis in the book. And what I say is that what's happening inside economics then in the 1970s, figures like Lucas and Sargent are indicative of this, is the rise of financial economists, right? Economists who specialize in the study of financial markets out there. Right? You also have a general shift in the profession where economists are more prominent in financial institutions and central banks, right? And so I characterize the emergence of this new kind of expert figure, this new kind of economist, and I use this little acronym TFE, which stands for the Transnational Finance-Oriented Economist, right? So the reason I characterize it in this way is because the point here I want to make is that by this time, by the 1960s and 1970s, left parties and economics are deeply interdependent. Left parties, politicians in general, are not going to draw experts that don't have the distinction of prestige, right? And what happens inside the economics profession, and this is driven especially by American economics, is that the most prestigious economics are transnational, finance-oriented economists. They're more often sort of involved in international institutions, they're connected to financial institutions, and they're specialists in the dynamics of financial markets and money, right? And so these are still, by and large, economists who understand themselves as center-left. Social democrats, labor economists, socialists, in the US case, they're democratic economists, but they see things in a very different way. And what they offer is a very different kind of device than someone like Walter Heller, which is how to not interfere with markets. Right? So I say in the book it's proscriptive instead of prescriptive, right? And then the argument that I make is that what you see inside left parties is this sort of fracturing in faith in the usefulness of economists, because they're not giving helpful advice that helps them address their strategic concerns, right? Because they're being told you cannot do things to please labor, to please your voters, you have to do what markets dictate. Right? So as an example of this, I get into the book in the case of the saving of the markets and the Mexican peso crisis. In the interest of time, I won't go into it in any depth. But if you look at the accounts of people like Summers and Rubin about what's happening at the time, there's no, right, they're concerned about budgets, right? They're concerned about balancing the budget. There's no extra money. But after NAFTA, when Mexico becomes the third largest trading partner for the United States, they're very concerned about saving the Mexican peso. And they go through an incredible set of operations in order to make it possible to free up a bunch of money that does not exist in theory in order to save the peso. Right? And the language here is, there's kind of a tautology, or there's a sort of a logic, a circular logic in language is we have to save markets, and so that we have to save markets even though we also can't tell them what to do, right? And in doing so, we make markets possible. Right? It's this kind of rationale that, in retrospect, is, in my opinion, striking. So the argument that I make is that when you get these kinds of economists, they're still influential, but they have a more sort of difficult, complicated, mediated relationship with center-left parties. And so what you get are these other kinds of experts specialized in other things, especially experts specialized in strategy, right? Experts that can solve the problem of how do you win elections when you can no longer advocate for policies that actually respond to what your constituents would like, right? Well, you have to resort to spin. You have to spin unpopular messages just enough to get yourself elected, right? And so there's what I argue is there's sort of elective affinity between the TFE and the strategic expert consultants, the spin doctor, who becomes an important figure in all the countries that I deal with in the 1990s. Right? So there's sort of a relationship between these two kinds of experts. Right? So the argument here is that market-promoting policies like bailouts and Social Security reductions, they're a tough sell. Right? And so center-left parties need spin to win. So what you find then in the late 90s and the early 2000s is a very different kind of trilogy of experts. Right? The TFE, the policy specialists, the think tank-based policy wonks who specialize in, especially in things like, well, how do we modify welfare institutions so that they can be reconciled with demands of markets, and strategic experts, especially based in who have backgrounds or professional ties to consulting, professional political consulting. Right, so that is the argument. So I'll just get to some concluding comments. I do have a sort of causal argument about also what causes the second transition, which is what I was saying before about the politicization of economics, that when you have a close relationship between a scientific field and a political field, it tends to politicize the science. So I call that a Mannheimian dynamic as opposed to a Polanyian one. What you get then is a reformatting of party-expert relations. You get new kinds of experts who did not exist in prior historical moments. You have new ethics or sort of rules for what one's responsibilities are in public life, and then new leftism. So that is a general picture of that story, which I will not dwell on. And then some food for thought. So this was not meant to be a prescriptive book. I've been having some trouble making into a definite set of arguments about, say, institutional design, but I do think it has some implications for how parties should operate and how academics, experts, professionals should think of themselves in public life. So one argument that I would make is that academics and professionals who intervene in politics should need to understand that they are playing the role, a representative role, especially in left parties, right? That they are speaking for people who are disempowered in theory, right, in the political world. So it matters especially what they represent and how. I also make an argument. In the Jacobin interview that I sent out the link for, I make an argument that left parties or left politics should not need spin, right? Something is wrong in representational politics on the left if left parties have to resort to spin doctors in order to win elections. Right? So it's a symptom, the rise of strategists is a symptom of left parties' representational failures. And then I have another argument about how do we then cultivate progressive economic expertise. And I'm happy to return to this, but one of my convictions on that is that one of the things that happens with decline of economists like Heller is a decline of the public capacity for engaging in technical economic questions. Because they played a sort of educational role in a certain sense. And so there needs to be a reinvestment in public capacity for critical economic analysis and a broadening of the profile of the economist. And what I mean by that is it should not be the case that you have to be technically qualified as an economist in order to speak to economic questions in an authoritative way. And part of that, I think, is being willing to listen to people's own accounts of their economic situation, their economic experiences, and understand that as a form of expertise. And that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Once again, I'll take Q and Jorge, and then after Jorge.
Thank you very much. I wanted to address 2 points, basically about representation and the idea of the prism first. How, just to give you a comparative example, in the case of Latin America, left parties have rejected Marx in some sense when it came to human rights, and they became the defenders of human rights against right-wing dictatorships, right? Which pushed a lot of left parties to, in the recent crisis in Venezuela, to advocate for open borders for Venezuelan refugees. But a lot of the the leftist, Marxist academics that were behind this move were middle higher class, were champagne left.
Champagne socialists.
Yeah, we call them caviares, like caviar.
Right.
So when we have 750,000 Venezuelan refugees, they're not taking the jobs at the university, they're taking the jobs of the people who were informally occupied to begin with, right? And that people is angry. I'm not saying we should close the border in Peru. I'm saying that that is a reality that nobody in the left care about, because it's about the principle, it's about doing what's right. And that's creating a lot of internal struggle, setting up the ground for a radical right-wing dictator again. Seems like a cycle of problems when you miss this representation. But that comes to the 4-point, now that leads me to your 4-point, the 4 recommendation. Basically, don't forget people. And I saw this movement happening in Western academia. I've been lucky enough to live in 3 continents by now. And I've never seen somebody so detached from human experience as academics. Right? It's like, oh, we're going to idealize this human being at the expense of Trump coming over, because NAFTA and the outsourcing of jobs from the United States, the disenfranchisement of your own people, seem to come from, or at least without opposition, from people in academia who were not caring. Nobody, like most political philosophers, didn't care that much because your job was not at risk. Right? Sociologists were like, yeah, we can, like, not that while ago I heard somebody, a well-positioned political philosophy, talking about how it would be nice if somebody helped the ghetto Latinos and black people from the United States. It would be nice. Have you ever been to ghetto? No, but it would be nice, I'm pretty sure. The object of a study of people, using people as an object of study, has been always popular in academia. But there's a real detachment that I can tell. And that seems to be problematic because you don't even know how to talk to people anymore.
Right, and so that's an institutional effect. You know, you're describing people who move in a professional world where it is not a necessity for them to communicate with people who they don't want to communicate, who they're nonetheless with, who they're nonetheless speaking for, right? So it's exactly the thing that I'm worried about, right? You know, one of the things that is most striking to me about those early agitators is that they never would have acquired positions of intellectual authority in parties if they could not meaningfully communicate with trade unions and working class people. And they were upper middle class. These were not, you know, these were not trade union guys for the most part. They weren't working class guys. They were artisans, maybe, right? Shoemakers or something like that. Or a doctor in Hilferding's case. But it was impossible for them not to move through grassroots worlds and become authorities, right? They had to be able to communicate with those folks. I do think that changed once they were in office, right? Power corrupts. And they also had a certain way of thinking about the economy. It was actually very conservative. They were fiscal conservatives, and that didn't serve the interests of their unemployed constituents in the 30s. But so to me, it really is a problem of sort of position and communication. And I guess I'm sort of pessimistic about whether one can engineer an academic profession or academic institutions in a way that compels academics who want to intervene in politics to have to move through actual communities and speak to people on the ground as sort of a kind of qualification, right? And then how you keep them grounded even once they're in office.
Social skills 101.
Right. It's a very kind of authority problem, and it's the tendency that Robert Michel's identified about the dynamics of a bureaucracy or a political party, right? Become hierarchical and removed. So it's I do think that there's an argument to be made for the Phillips curve came up earlier, and there's an argument to be made that the Phillips curve was actually a way of thinking about the world that sort of sublimated politics into the opposing interests, at least of finance and labor, right? So people who have money don't like inflation. People who have jobs don't like unemployment, right? And so insisting that these things had to be in balance, that you constantly had to attend to the balance of these two things, was in a way class politics playing out through the use of a technical managerial device, right, invented by an economist. I do think it is possible for those devices, if they aren't conflated with reality, right, to become tools for dealing with the conflict of interests and the competing needs of constituents. I also think that one of the most important things that parties do is they actually develop and cultivate people's political identities, right? So they can, if they are persuasive, if they understand the perspectives of the people they're trying to convince to be on board with, say, an open borders policy, right? That there is a way of trying to persuade them that actually they have interests in common with these other groups that they're trying to speak for, right? But there has to be sort of a practical underpinning to that, and that is that those groups are all kind of in the room, right? So I don't know if that really answers your question, but those are the ruminations that it inspires.
Thank you.
Phil?
Yeah, I have a question about what happened when Keynesianism was discredited in the 1970s. And that it's one thing to say that Keynes's theory can explain stagflation, and we've got a real serious problem here. Let's try some other things. That's one response. But another is to say, Keynes and Keynesians and Walter Howard, that's not even science. Mm-hmm. Especially coming from the mouths of persons who are practitioners of something that whose own claim to be scientific at all is somewhat in dispute. Let me put it differently. When you find that to use Thomas Kuhn's image of the paradigm, when you find that you need an epicycle, you put on the epicycle, and maybe you need to keep putting them on for a while. You don't just normally just say, we need an epicycle, we need a new paradigm, just like that. Mm-hmm. You try to work it through. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm just baffled how, I think it was in 1972, Richard Nixon could say, we're all Keynesians now, and within a decade, Keynesians are not only, they're just not, they're like, astrologers.
Right. Right. It is, and it happens very rapidly, surprisingly rapidly. I'm sure Walter Heller would say, what's going on?
Parenthetically, that nobody on the left could possibly have appreciated at the time what was going on.
Right.
It was as though suddenly the entire context of policy and political discussions with respect to the economy had utterly changed, and it's, in my case, taken almost another half century to even realize that something had happened. How did this happen without anybody knowing?
So, two things. One thing I sort of skipped over was the 60s, right? This whole sort of fracturing of politics and the rise of new social movements and feminist movements and civil rights movements and all of those things. So there's a general fracturing that's going on in the late 1960s, and it's around that same time, it's a little bit early, I think it's 1965 or something, that the term stagflation was coined by a conservative MP in the House of Commons, whose name is escaping me, and he's at the time attacking the Wilson government for its overdependence on Keynesian economists to manage the economy, right? It's just they're making everything go wrong. See, and so that term was born in that moment as a way of attacking exactly the kind of managerial economist that Heller was, right? And also implicitly, I think one can argue that one of the main complaints there is Keynesian economics is an economics at the left, right? It's a labor economics, it's a socialist economics. It's not general science, it's not general truth, right? And it's failing as a mechanism for managing the economy. And the interesting thing about stagflation then is it becomes in 1979, right? It becomes a reason for Lucas and Sargent to declare that Keynesian economists aren't economists anymore. And there's no, in that whole statement, that whole article that I'm referencing there is no reference to the oil price shocks. There is no reference to geopolitical events. There is no reference to history, right? Or current events. It's just a scientific revolution. And I actually think the work of Thomas Kuhn contributed to this way of thinking, right? This is how science operates, and we're economists, and we're science, and therefore this is how, right?
We can be confirmed.
Right, and that's the account that Samuelson then starts giving in his textbook. Paul Samuelson, he starts saying, like, well, science revolutionizes C. Kuhn, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you actually look inside the Carter administration, for instance, in the 1970s, when they're struggling with inflation, it is by no means obvious to people in the administration that this has anything to do with science or scientific models of the economy or scientific understandings of the economy. What it seems to them is that oil prices are too high, plain and simple, right? This is an oil problem, and it's why you got new efforts in energy and environmental policy in the Carter years. That was their response to stagflation, right? It was not a breakdown of a Keynesian understanding of the world or an understanding that there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Or, that was perfectly intact. It was just not intact with some of the economists who were in advisory positions in the Carter administration. And so it's at that time you get this politicization and this frustration with Carter's advisors who are looking to economists who are saying, well, the solution to this has nothing to do with oil prices. In fact, what you should do is you should deregulate and let free competition take hold, which only intensified the political, potentially intensified the political dilemmas of the Carter administration and the question of whether Carter could possibly get reelected, right? So it was not at all obvious that stagflation was a thing, right? Inside democratic networks in the 70s, and I think that's probably true in other countries. In other words, the stagflation diagnosis became an ex post story about what happened that was actually very much contested and easily contestable at the time based on people's observations of what was actually happening in the world.
Dan.
Thank you. This, I think, was a very good parallel to Blythe's article in the suggested readings for the summer school. I'm not sure if you read it or not, but this actually tracks, again, the transformation of political parties in the West along with these macroeconomic changes until recently, where the cartel party hasn't really evolved in the face of, in the aftermath of the economic fallout, hence the rise of these populist parties. So it's not really necessary, but maybe you can say a word or two about how you see yours sort of concluding with that
Right.
analysis. And also, this is probably an obvious point, whether you see this as in fact being part of story as to this explosion of populist parties, and whether, how much populist rhetoric, let's say, has a role to play in, let's say, reinvigorating left politics, or bringing it back to, what ostensibly we want it to be.
Mm.
I mean, shifting away from this kind of neoliberal kind of economy. So there's a lot of leftist thinkers out there, political theorists. I'm thinking of Chantal, who I wrote my MA on her, who, I think feels very vindicated now to see that there's a lot of these left-wing parties that are taking on that kind of popular trajectory and are making gains. And her argument is that the left needs to take on this kind of trajectory. And this seems to not kind of track with that particular argument. This seems to be arguing for something else, that this economism is necessary, but on the one hand, we both have to educate, better educate the general populace into economic matters, but on the other hand, maybe tweak the rhetoric of this so it doesn't sound like we're completely out of touch with the people. But what exactly would that look like if not just riling people up?
Right. So the first thing on the cartel party story, so that story, as I understand it, especially from Peter Maier's work, I think it was, it's, for me, it was an important sort of starting point in some ways, and I think part of or how I understand what I'm trying to do here is to give a more targeted, fine-grained, getting into the actual dynamics of people inside parties kind of analysis that when you look at it from a more sort of macro institutional organizational level, which is a level of analysis in Maier's story, and his story of how what's happening is that parties are moved from civil society to the state, right? That part of that my story is kind of complementary to that story. Here's what's actually happening inside left parties in the world of expertise. That makes it look like this from an organizational standpoint. I never found the story quite as persuasive for the American case because the American parties are very different and the argument wasn't developed really with reference to those parties, and Peter Maier kind of said, well, it applies to them too, but I was never satisfied with that. So for me, this was a more kind of satisfactory way of tracking these processes over time in very different kinds of party organizations. So how do you bring left politics back? That's just like $1 million question, isn't it? I think part of what I want to argue is that, and this is this argument about experts, academics, professionals, philosophers, sociologists being representatives, is maybe sort of pie in the sky argument that where I think, and this goes back to maybe your story about these sort of isolated academics, right? That when academics sit in a room, experts sit in a room talking about people out there or the world out there, that we are representing things. We are characterizing things. We are talking about, we are trying to make an argument what they are in essence, what they mean, what's to be done, right? And then every now and then you end up a minister of finance, right? And so there's a lot of important things there. One is the way that you characterize things needs to be grounded in the experience of people if you want to then move those arguments into political spaces. Right? So you need to be able to convince your advisors, your colleagues, right, and politicians on high, and you need to also be able to convince the people whose lives will be affected if your vision of the world becomes enacted in policies. Right? So that's sort of pie in the sky, but I think it would be nice. Part of that also, I think, is this kind of idea that I have about sort of qualifying people to re-engage in debates about economic policy questions. And so I think there's really been this process between the 60s, and there was this process between the 60s, 70s, and the early 2000s, where I think economic questions were ceded to the experts. They were ceded to economists, they were ceded to the technocrats, they were ceded to banks and central bankers especially, right? And one of the effects of that was a sort of draining of public capacity to be able to speak authoritatively to economic questions, right? People don't feel like they're allowed to, right? And I find it a problem in the classroom, right? We can, you know, Professor Mudge, this is a sociology class. We can't talk about central banks, you know? And, you know, so it's, you know, my argument here is partly conditioned by that. You know, I don't think that's going to solve the problem. I think at this point, honestly, my diagnosis of mainstream left parties is a little hopeless at the moment. I worry that they've actually lost their capacity to work in the way that they need to, in a way that would rebuild left politics. So maybe, you know, what we find now is this kind of volatility, the formation of new parties that are gaining power, gaining seats, and those parties are maybe can become kind of containers, right, for, right.
You have something to add?
Well, just a very brief remark about Lucas. I mean, if he really does think he's bringing about a Hegelian paradigm change, then the game's up immediately. Because what Kuhn does is import political metaphors into the philosophy of science. So why are we talking about scientific revolutions? Well,
Right.
because this guy thinks that political metaphors are the way to think about the
Right.
evolution of knowledge. So kind of the game's up with Lucas is saying, you know what, yeah, it's a war.
Right. Right.
Because that's not what he's saying. He's saying, oh, it's just the truth.
Right.
I've got a good theory, they've got a bad theory.
Right.
I'm sorry. You know, you're just on the losing side, but
Yeah.
I'm the better scientist.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's maybe a separate book to be written about that, right? Because, you know, what's really interesting is Paul Samuelson, who literally wrote the book on Keynesian economics, who characterizes Milton Friedman and the Chicago economists as these like nutty, marginal, you know, crazies out there in Chicago in the early 70s. By the 80s, he's talking in the language of Kuhnian scientific revolution, and which is partly, I think, can be viewed as a way of saying, we weren't wrong exactly. This is just how science works, right?
I kind of think you answered my question in your last response there. I was basically just going to ask, like, do you think that there's some meaningful difference between, like, representing someone's interest versus advocating for someone's interest? Like, are there reasons that you use representatives rather than, like, advocates for?
Right. I guess, yeah, the reason I use the term representation is because of that problem of representation in left
Like
parties
the
that,
ontological
right,
representation.
exactly, that when you have political institutions in which the channels of communication don't allow or selectively allow people to speak for themselves, right, then what you get is people speaking for them.
Yeah.
Right? And so they read the world, they read what people want, and you can read things from inside closed doors, right? Here are polling results. This is what this means, and this is what the people want, right? Or you can read things based on your actual experience in a particular community, right? But what you are doing is you are formulating a certain vision, right, of what people want, what's in their interests, right, which may or may not actually speak to their needs and problems.
So then you think, like, advocating for would be different because it's more of the, like, grassroots.
That's
kind
Yeah, that's why I would prefer the term representation over advocacy. I mean, it's, you know, maybe there's not really a very clear or neat distinction to be made between the two things. Maybe that's precisely part of the problem. But I am, part of what I'm trying to do there is to, you know, in a certain sense, what I realized in doing research for this book was that Keynesian economists in the mid-60s were representatives. They were representing the interests of people and classes, and, you know, and they had, I think, a certain awareness of that, right? And part of that was they had to have an awareness of that because the trade unions were in the room. You know, when they wanted to manage wages and prices, you had to have people in the room to talk about how that's going to work, right? So they couldn't pretend that they weren't dealing with interests, with competing interests. It was as a practical necessity of Keynesian economic policy making to deal with them. You know, now I sometimes worry that I sort of, I don't want to be sort of heroizing or glorifying this particular figure. There are all kinds of problems too, right? But I do think that is one of the things that made them distinctive relative to the kinds of economists that you find in left parties at the beginning of the 21st century.
So just a couple of things to think about. I know the book backwards. If you get the book, you'll find I've blurred it, so obviously I'm well familiar with it. So I'm not going to say, what about this? That would seem to be rather redundant. Just a plug for the work of two of my PhD students. So the first one's Tammy Oren, who was an Israeli scholar. And she had this, and she worked with Michael Shalab and I, and she had this really interesting thing. She said, a lot of what you people do is just periodization. And there are some obvious periods, right? The 1930s is obviously an interesting period, and that seems to be different from the 1950s. But I want to write about Britain up to the financial crisis, but I'm going to start in 1958. That's a bit, sell it, right? And then she wrote the thesis, and it's quite sustainable. And I don't, still to this moment don't know what to make of this fact, so I'll just give you a short version of what it is. In the 1950s, the major problem in terms of the debate between sort of policy intellectuals, if you want to put it that way, was what was causing inflation in the British economy above average for the rest of Europe. And the truth was, as far as they could figure out, the City of London. So the City of London was becoming politicized. So the City of London didn't want to become politicized because of stop-go macro, basically. You would pile in imports and that would become unsustainable. There would be a collapse in the exchange rate, that would suck in inflation from the import channel. You'd then cut the budget, unemployment would rise because it got too far. You would then stop doing that and you would continue the cycle. It's called stop-go. So what was causing stop-go? And the answer was it was the City of London. The City of London was very powerful and had just restored sort of convertibility of currencies in 1958. And they started to invest a lot of money. And we think that the think tank politics is new, but they set up the Industrial Relations Institute at Oxford. And basically the point of industrial relations was to basically say, it's the fault of labour. So the whole thing was essentially on wildcat labour and indiscipline and how British workers can't internalise the costs, and that's where inflation comes from. So you run through this and then you get to 69 and you get in place of strife, which is the big industrial relations legislation that was partly about inflation control, which the unions quite rightly said, fuck off, we're not doing this. It's nothing to do with us, it's the City of London. So there was this hidden battle going on the whole time. And you can run this through to 79. What is the first thing that Thatcher does? It's the abolition of exchange controls. Right? So she tells the story right the way through the financial crisis. And it gives you a completely different set of possibilities. So what I take from this is we have a tendency across the social sciences and humanities, but particularly in the social sciences, for analytic reductionism. This is one part of the story, and it's a coherent part of the story. But this thing is grotesquely overdetermined. So the interesting question becomes, what's driving the overdetermination of these things, and how do we best understand that? And I don't think that anyone does a good job for that. So that's just something to think about. The other one is Odne Helgadottir, who now teaches at Copenhagen Business School, and she really got into the methods side of this on the economic side as to what was going on. And this basically was back in 1951. Milton Friedman writes a piece about the impossibility of mathematizing the consumption function. So basically, C is a function of Y, so Y determines consumption. There's no way to reduce that down to individual spending decisions. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on in economics, Lipsey and Lancaster, whatever, all through the 50s, 60s, 70s. And it canonizes in 1973 with a grotesquely named paper, which is Schonenstein, Mantel, de Breu, that basically says that you can't actually add up individual demand curves to get to an aggregate demand curve. It's too unstable. So there's no such thing as aggregate supply that can meet it. So you've got a kind of internal Keynesian critique of all the stuff that Keynesians do, right? And then along comes not Lucas and rational expectations. It's the real business cycle people who were basically regarded as a joke. And nobody took their macro seriously, but what they did was they reinvented how to model the macro economy. Because the only way around the Jonathan Mantel-de-Breu problem, the micro foundations problem, how do you link the micro and the macro, is to basically make it a non-problem by pretending the entire economy is a single agent that moves through time that gets battered with shocks. And that is the best econometric modeling technique that's ever been invented, because when you get to that, you can do what's called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium modeling, which is the core of all modern modeling for the past 30 years. So what Odne shows is basically the Keynesians don't give up Keynes. They basically surrender to the micro foundations critique, adopt the model that allows you to talk about micro foundations. But once you do that, once the economy becomes an agent, bouncing through time, adjusting to shocks, there's no aggregate demand, there's no aggregate supply, there's no classes, there's no distribution, there's absolutely nothing. It's not what the economy is. But once you've done that, there's no way to have a Keynesian argument.
Right.
It's over. That's it. So then, since that point, you've had 2 generations of economists who have been trained in that technique. And it really is only the financial crisis that basically makes them go, hang on a minute. And it was summed up very, very well by an economist who said, he says, when I was trained to ask the following question: what is the optimal monetary policy for an economy like ours? Here's the question I should have been asking: who gets fucked when I raise interest rates? Because it's exactly the same question, but it's an entirely different question. And that's what the politics of that period was very much about.
One quick thing. I actually think, so one of the obstacles for me for thinking about the second transition, the transition to third wave politics, was precisely this periodization thing, the standard story of, well, once upon a time there were Keynesian understandings of the world and that worked pretty well, and then that model collapsed and we couldn't do that things anymore, and that was because of stagflation, and then there's a new world. And so if you're going to analyze the neoliberal period, or whatever you want to call it, then you start sometime in like the late 60s or early 70s or something like that, right? And we know what happens, what the starting point is. We don't have to re-examine that. We start with stagflation and the collapse of Keynesianism. And one of the advantages, I think, of adding this kind of biographical dimension to a comparative and historical analysis is that people don't just appear magically, out of the blue, fully formed, as economists and public figures in 1975. They have a trajectory, and so when you look at it in that way and you want to trace that trajectory, you can't take those periodizations for granted. And what I found is that you actually find a lot of reason to call them into question.
I think we started a little late. Maybe we can do 2 more questions. Nathan will be the next, and then after that, Fernando.
Sorry, this is really ill-formed, but it looks to me like one of the interesting features of the party as the prism is that the finance ministers and the other people, the experts, are speaking into multiple legitimacy discourses at the same time. Their speech has to be legitimated by their own party members, by their peers, other potential finance ministers or governmental ministers, and also to the broader political discourse, right? And one of the weird features of neoliberalism is it looks like the sort of professional legitimacy discourse becomes, the broader political legitimacy discourse becomes just like the language of economics. Like if you can speak in economic speak, you're politically legitimate more broadly. So I think one of the questions that is interesting for the question of the future is what's the new legitimacy discourse? If the neoliberal discourse has collapsed, what sort of legitimacy discourse takes its place? Is it a more populist one, and who can speak into that? And if it's someone with these qualities, if the discourse is no longer this purely scientific one, then someone with these qualities might be sort of more qualified to speak into whatever new broader political legitimacy discourse we're in now.
Right. Well, so one of the interesting things that happens after the third wave period or during really is that the position of the Minister of Finance becomes less important, less influential. And part of that has to do with the rise of the autonomy of central banks and their disproportionate power. I think Mark talked about this, this sort of period in which everyone starts to know the names of the governors of central banks. And so part of that has to do with institutional changes that are underway that shift the power of people embedded in national governments relative to people who are embedded in central banks. And also in the European case, transnational financial and monetary institutions, especially the European institutions, the European Central Bank. And so one of the things that happens then is, you're right, I think between the sort of 40s and the 60s, you need to speak in the language of economics in order to occupy this position. But then one of the things that happens during and after the third wave period is that position actually becomes less important and less influential. And one of the things that you see, and this gets back actually to that story of the rise of strategists in political consulting, is that instead of people who once they are a party's Minister of Finance or kind of appointed as the person who will be Minister of Finance if the party enters into government, they were there for life, right? Important, powerful position, right? And that was grounded in loyalty to a party. particular kind of, socialist, social democratic party. What you find for figures who occupy that position, Sweden is the best case of this, in the 90s and the early 2000s, is they're there for a while. There's a lot of volatility. This finance minister is in, and then someone else is in, and then someone else is in. And what do they do when they leave office? They become international consultants, right? And they're particularly experts in how to reform welfare states. So it's, in a way, I think.
It's corruption.
Yes, it could be called corruption.
That's all it is.
Right.
You're corrupt.
Right. Yes, so in a way, I think, in a very strange way, economics actually declines in its public influence after this period, at least as national, political, and public figures. But they become very important international, transnational financial institutions and in central banks.
Just a caveat on that, there's a very important implication of what you're saying, which you don't really fully draw out, which you've just exposed, which I want to back, is that it's not just the prism as in a lens or a prison in which you're trapped, to play with it even more, right? What it basically says is things could have been otherwise. It's the contingency flip, right? So that means that economics as a correspondence theory of the world, that is to say, the map really corresponds to territory. So if you go this way, this works, and if you don't, it doesn't, right? There's kind of tolerances on that map. And some periods are more forgiving than others, right? And what's happened is we've got to a bit where the map and the territory have become stunningly disconnected. And at that point in time, people who just recognize that actually get more credibility than the people who say, no, the map's fine, it's great, we just need more smart policies to nudge people in the right direction. That's done. But what it points to is we can fill that in with whatever we like. So again, it's about, what that shows is it's about imagination. How do you take this environment that we couldn't quite understand and turn it into something, whether it's in that period, the inevitability of globalization, or the fact that we have to do this, right? Well, just tell us a different have to.
Right.
That's really it.
Yes.
I mean, in that sense, this really is a deep sociological account, because what it says is these are contingent social facts, period.
Yep. Yes, it's a message that I have been unable to sell to German audiences who don't feel that there ever was any alternative whatsoever. But it is a message that has been appealing with other audiences, so maybe one day they'll come around.
The French like it more than the Germans. I'll bet they do it.
Yeah, I think so. The French audiences that I've had have been very, this is why I had this big thing about, like, I don't mean intellectuals do everything. They've been very sensitive to that. Those audiences were very sensitive to that argument. Are you kind of, and there's a sort of tendency to fall back on an interpretation of my argument as mechanistic, right? So neoliberalism happens because the experts did it,
Right.
kind of argument. So, which I know one has to take pains to avoid and preempt. So that's fine.
Rondo, you get the last word.
I wanted to further provoke you and Mark Light, and I'm really happy because I saw him jumping right in by mentioning corruption. My question would be, so I was rereading also his article, and he quotes Rudy Dornbusch, so the MIT economist, and his work on Latin American populism. And thinking about what he just said about representations and what we are representing when we take these positions as economists, as professionals. I can't remember whether it's in this book, but he analyzes Chilean economy of Salvador Allende. And he explains how he made a bunch of blunders, which he definitely did. But there's also an interesting aspect. Nixon said to the CIA, and these are his words, make their economy scream. This is not factored in. So, and scream it did. So the economy, when it collapsed, there was capital strike, and there was all sorts of evils. So I think both you and Mark are very polite in the sense of not talking so much about corruption and about this, because both of you talk about how the finance sector kind of captures these people or foster them and put them in the highlight. But can you be less polite and develop like this dirty way of like one thing giving force, like reinforcing each other?
I have moments when I'm less polite. So part of what's going on there, the reason I try to be sort of, I'm not trying to be polite so much as analytical, right? On the sort of very sociological assumption that we are not really in control of our conditions of existence and the possibilities available to us at any particular point. And one of the things that I think is absolutely true, and that I think probably a lot of economists will tell you if I present this story to them, is our main problem is that no one listens to us.
Yeah, they always say that.
Right? Our main problem is that if they only did what we said, everything would be okay. But the message is, actually, when I move into government or I get involved in political circles, they can take or leave what I say depending on what suits them, and they will distort it in ways that serve their purposes, and they will jettison me as soon as I'm not useful anymore. And so I think what they're actually doing when they say that is they're expressing something very real, right? Politicians who control governments can jettison whoever they want, right? So if you are, and this is a dilemma that confronts any academic, any expert, any person who wants to participate in public life, who wants to participate in policymaking discussions, these kinds of things, is how do you not get sort of, how do you speak to politicians, right? Advise them in a way that doesn't compromise you. And I think also it's important to, as a sort of addendum to that, I don't take for granted that the people, that economists or anyone else are necessarily good people or bad people, or I think it's from a sociological perspective, it's not my responsibility to evaluate that. But I do think that academics in public life often have, or experts of any kind, often have the experience of not actually being in control and having restricted avenues of influence, of access. And it presents an eternal dilemma to them. I think it's certainly true that people can handle that dilemma by not worrying about it, by deciding they're going to just nakedly pursue cash or prestige or influence and just not worry about the ethical compromises that they're making. But maybe that's something that's more of a question of normative political philosophy, right? Than it is for the job of a historical comparative sociologist.
With that, let's thank our speakers.